So far in our series on the Presocratic philosophers, the thinkers we've been discussing were primarily focused on one question: what is the world made out of? And we got many different answers. Sometimes it's a material element like water or air, sometimes it's an abstract principle like the infinite or an eternal unity. Is there a rational logic to the change we see in the universe? Can it all be explained by math? In today's video, we're going to see some of those ideas come together in the Pluralism of Anaxagoras and Empedocles, who propose that the objects we encounter in the world are composites of multiple different elements, instead of just one element in different forms. To answer how these different elements joined together and broke apart, they would begin to introduce abstract forces such as love, strife, and a cosmic mind which they thought provided order to the universe. Hey, I'm Matt, you're watching Nothing New, and today we're entering the home stretch of our video series on the Presocratic philosophers. Though they aren't as famous as the other thinkers we've previously covered, Empedocles would earn the praise of Aristotle, who would adopt aspects of his philosophy, such as the four elements. Anaxagoras would end up being an important influence on not just Pericles, but also on Plato and perhaps even Socrates after becoming the first Presocratic to settle in Athens. Or at least that's what the ancients say. Gotta take everything with a grain of salt after all. But before we dive in, if you missed the previous videos, definitely check out our playlist on the Presocratics, and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any future videos on ancient philosophy. Anyways, let's get into it. You've probably heard of the four classical elements, or the belief that all the world is made up of a mixture of earth, water, air, and fire. Cultures from around the world have some version of the classical elements, though they differ between 4 or 5 elements, which sometimes include ether, metal, and even wood. Empedocles is the earliest Western philosopher to systematize the 4 elements, which Aristotle would later adopt and associate with their properties such as hot, cold, wet, and dry. This theory of the elements would later be unified with the theory of the 4 humors, though this was not done by famous ancient doctors at the time such as Hippocrates and Galen. Philosopher Anthony Kenny tells us how Empedocles' philosophy of nature can be regarded, from one point of view, as a synthesis of the thought of the Ionian philosophers. As we have seen, each of them had singled out some one substance as the basic or dominant stuff of the universe. Thales had privileged water, Anaximenes air, Xenophanes earth, and Heraclitus fire. For Empedocles, all 4 of these substances stood on equal terms as the fundamental ingredients, or roots as he put it, of the universe. These roots had always existed, he maintained, but they mingle with each other in various proportions in such a way as to produce the familiar furniture of the world and also the denizens of the heavens. Did you notice that he uses the word roots and not elements? That's how far back in the history of ideas we are. As far as we can tell, Plato was the first to actually use the Greek term stoicheon, which we now translate as element, whereas the word Empedocles used to describe the elements was rhizomata. While he is more famous today for grouping together the classical elements, his importance in philosophy lays in his theories about how these elements interacted. Aristotle praised Empedocles for having realized that a cosmological theory must not just identify the elements of the universe, but must assign causes for the development and intermingling of the elements to make the living and inanimate compounds of the actual world. Empedocles assigns this role to love and strife. Love combines the elements, and strife forces them apart. At one time, the roots grow to be one out of many. At another time, they split to be many out of one. These things, he said, never cease their continual interchange, now through love coming together into one, now carried apart from each other by strife's hatred. In essence, love and strife are the picturesque ancestors of the forces of attraction and repulsion which have figured in physical theory throughout the ages. Empedocles may have been inspired by the observation of magnets when he suggested that the whole world was driven by these 2 forces that push and pull everything together and apart. His cosmology is characterized by a cycle between periods where one of these forces or the other is predominant, and like Pythagoras, he believed in reincarnation and advocated vegetarianism, though it is unlikely he studied under Pythagoras like later accounts of his life claim. Some of his ideas sound quite outlandish today. For instance, consider his account of the rise of animals. On the earth, many heads sprung up without necks and arms, wandered bare and bereft of shoulders. Eyes strayed up and down in one of 4 heads, solitary limbs wandered seeking for union. But as divinity was mingled still further with divinity, these things joined together as each might chance, and many other things besides them continually arose. Shambling creatures with countless hands, Many creatures with faces and breasts looking in different directions were born. Some, offspring of oxen with faces of men, while others, again, arose as offspring of men with the heads of oxen, and creatures in whom the nature of women and men was mingled, furnished with sterile parts. Yes, just as he supposed simple elements joined together to form more complex objects, he figured that at first disembodied organs and limbs wandered the earth, joining together in many crazy configurations. He may have been influenced by the many mythological animals which seem to be composites of real-life animals, such as centaurs, sphinxes, and chimeras. As the useless and sterile configurations died off, the well-put-together combinations survived and became all the different species of animals we see today. Is this the early signs of a theory of natural selection? Darwin certainly thought so, since he hailed Empedocles for shadowing forth the principle of natural selection. But it's at this point in his philosophy where things begin to get a little muddled, and we've already seen that he can have some, let's say, unique ideas. He thought that vision was similar to the sense of touch, and that streams of light poured out of our eyes and touched the objects we saw. In fact, this may have been a fairly common belief in antiquity that influenced the use of evil eye charms, amulets, and talismans to protect from malevolent glares. All in all, while Empedocles was surely a very intuitive and creative person, he kind of epitomizes the classic criticism of philosophy at that time. He was too busy asking questions about the things above the clouds and below the earth, aka things people at that time could never truly know about. He tries to explain everything, from planets and plants to the origins of species, and to me, it's a little hubristic. What's really hubristic is his legendary death. It seems Empedocles thought he was a reincarnated daimon, which was a lesser god or guiding spirit, working his way back up the chain of being to get back to the realm of the gods from which he was originally banished, perhaps for the sin of eating meat. There are multiple myths of his death that play on his seeming desire to be divine, all of which involve Mount Etna in Sicily, one of the tallest active volcanoes in Europe. In one version, he believed he would become an immortal god after death, and to prove this to his followers, he threw himself into the volcano. In another version, he threw himself in just so his followers would think he turned into a god, but the volcano foiled his plan by throwing back one of his bronze sandals, proving his mortality. In a later Hellenistic comedic dialogue, he is redeemed by being carried into the heavens by an eruption. I doubt any of these stories are true, but they may reflect a truth about his ambition. Empedocles is paired with Anaxagoras because they not only believed that the universe was made of a plurality of elements, but Anaxagoras also tried to explain how the world we live in was organized from the primordial chaos. To do that, he introduced the concept of Nous, which was like a cosmic mind which organized all of the universe. In the beginning, according to Anaxagoras, all things were together, infinite both in number and in smallness. For the small too was infinite, and when all things were together, none of them could be distinguished for their smallness. For air and ether prevailed over all things, being both of them infinite. For amongst all things, these are the greatest both in quantity and size. Before they were separated off, when all things were together, not even was any color distinguishable, for the mixture of all things prevented it, of the moist and dry, and the warm and cold, and the light and the dark, and of much earth that was in it, and of a multitude of innumerable seeds in no way like each other. For none of the other things either is like any other, and these things being so, we must hold that all things are in the whole. In everything there is a portion of everything, while Nous is infinite and self-ruled, and is mixed with nothing, but is alone itself by itself. For if it were not by itself, but were mixed with anything else, it would partake in all things if it were mixed with any. For in everything there is a portion of everything. As has been said by me in what goes before, and the things mixed with it would hinder it, so that it would have power over nothing in the same way that it has now being alone by itself. For it is the thinnest of all things and the purest, and it has all knowledge about everything and the greatest strength. And Nous has power over all things, both greater and smaller that have life. Nous set in order all things that were to be, and all things that were and are not now and that are. And this revolution in which now revolve the stars and the sun and the moon, and the air and the ether that are separated off. And this revolution calls the separating off, and the rare is separated off from the dense, the warm from the cold, the light from the dark, and the dry from the moist. And there are many portions in many things, but no thing is altogether separated off, nor distinguished from anything else except Nous. And all Nous is alike, both the greater and the smaller. while nothing else is like anything else, but each single thing is and was most manifestly those things of which it has most in it. As we can see, Anaxagoras believed that everything contained a mixture of everything else, and that objects were what they were because they contained a majority of that sort of fundamental ingredient. The ocean contains the seeds of all matter, but it mainly consists of water seeds. And again, the term he uses is seeds, or spermata, since it won't be until the atomists that we get a term for a smallest possible particle. And he barely explains the term or lists what kind of seeds or elements there could be like Empedocles did. But by theorizing that the seeds of everything were everywhere, he became the first to introduce the idea of panspermia, or that life is distributed throughout the universe. Though his philosophy sounds like mind-body dualism, mind is still matter, but just the thinnest or lightest kind of matter, which doesn't mix like the others, but has power over living beings, or like he says, anything with a soul. Though these early philosophers would become famous in time, they were not held in high regard by the general public. Plutarch says how the first man to put in writing the clearest and boldest of all doctrines about the changing phases of the moon was Anaxagoras, but he was no ancient authority, nor was his doctrine in high repute. It was still under seal of secrecy and made its way slowly among a few only who received it with a certain caution rather than with implicit confidence. Men could not abide the natural philosophers and visionaries, as they were then called, for that they reduced the divine agency down to irrational causes, blind forces, and necessary incidents. Even Protagoras had to go into exile. Anaxagoras was with difficulty rescued from imprisonment by Pericles, and Socrates, though he had nothing whatever to do with such matters, nevertheless lost his life because of philosophy. It was not until later times that the radiant repute of Plato, because of the life the man led, and because he subjected the compulsions of the physical world to divine and more sovereign principles, took away the criticism of such doctrines as these and gave their science free course among all men. Perhaps Anaxagoras was imprisoned for the same reason as Socrates, impiety, since he held that the sun was not a divinity, but a ball of red-hot metal. A spirit of rationalism is one of the main advantages Pericles had of his association with Anaxagoras. It appears that he was also lifted by him above superstition, that feeling which is produced by amazement at what happens in regions above us. It affects those who are ignorant of the causes of such things, and are crazed about divine intervention and confounded through their inexperience in this domain, whereas the doctrines of natural philosophy remove such ignorance and inexperience, and substitute for timorous and inflamed superstition that unshaken reverence which is attended by a good hope. There was no actual censorship of philosophers, though, and his writings seem to have been readily available in the bookstores of the Athenian Agora. According to Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, a young Socrates says how he seized the books very eagerly and read them as fast as I could, that I might know as fast as I could about the best and the worst. While Socrates seems to have always had an appetite for philosophy, Anaxagoras may have been the first to satisfy that hunger, at least for a moment, before Socrates' glorious hope was quickly snatched away from him, as he put it, and he soon became disillusioned. Anyways, that's all for today. Don't forget to like the video if you learned something new, and subscribe if you haven't already, and definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.